Rae Bonney, joined on the line by, amongst many other things, social commentator on men's rights issues, Bettina Arndt. Good morning, or actually good afternoon, Bettina.
Hello, Ray.
So wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Now, I know that you've been having a bit of a morning yourself today.
Oh, all hell was breaking loose here with alarms going, false alarms, you name it. So I hope we're going to have a peaceful hour, but we'll see how we go.
Oh, well, just settle in for the next hour with me, Bettina. I'll take
Good.
great care of you. Now, we met originally, I don't know if you remember, but there is a group, 1 in 3, which is a diverse group of male and female professionals who are very dedicated to raising public awareness of the existence and the needs of male victims of family violence and abuse.
Absolutely. Wonderful organisation, and they're doing a great job bringing together, putting up proper information about domestic violence particularly.
Yes.
And I'm a great believer in what they're doing.
Yes, no, and I've had a fair amount to do with them over the last 12 months especially, and I love the way that they present not so much as an argument, but just awareness raising around some of the issues that people, just normal people wouldn't be aware of around the human rights of men here, especially in Australia.
Absolutely, and correcting a lot of the misinformation that's constantly being promoted in Australia.
Yes.
No, it's very much needed, the work they're doing.
Yes, well, I gave you a bit of an intro before you dulled down your alarms that were going off, or your false alarms. Yes. So we did talk about your work with Forum and some of the publications that you've written around sex. And we've mentioned now sex on my show probably about 12 times now in the lead up to this.
Good,
so
okay.
can we just do a little bit on that,
Sure.
Bettina, about your early days, way back in the 70s, where these topics were so taboo, especially for men? What was it that really lit your fire back then?
Oh, I don't think it was especially for men. I think it was for everybody then. And I always think that was part of the attraction, really, that I do have this irresistible urge to get involved in issues we're not allowed to talk about. And it was certainly sex in the 70s. And it certainly applied to women as well as men. I got involved in the whole area when I was being trained as a clinical psychologist at University of New South Wales. And one of my teachers became interested in the new research that was being published. Famous sex researchers, Masters and Johnson, had just released really wonderful work they'd done on treating sexual problems. And this particular lecturer of mine wanted to try some of those ideas out. And so he started announced at the clinic where I was being trained that they would see sexual problems. And we were just inundated.
Yeah.
I was supposed to be doing general psychology, clinical psych, and we were just swamped with people that the doctors were referring, and people were turning up on their own, just finally somewhere to go to talk about sex.
Yes.
And I just thought it was a fantastic area. But it was really taboo, and so many people came in just with all these issues bottled up that no one had ever helped them with before. And I did my whole master's research on helping women in particular with orgasmic problems. And I put this tiny little notice in, I think, the Telegraph in Sydney, and, announcing I was looking for women who weren't achieving full sexual satisfaction, and just got inundated with people.
I'm not surprised.
And I was only 22, and I spent 6 months talking to women from ages,
Wow.
20 to 80 about their sex lives, and I just thought, this is amazing.
Yes, and with such probably, I'm assuming, limited experience yourself in the area, you probably gained a lot of
we were
insight.
being trained and learning to talk about it, and it's something somehow always come pretty naturally to me.
Yes.
I had a very liberated mother who always was. She used to import banned books, things like Lady Chatterley's Lover that was restricted in Australia back in the 50s and 60s, I think, and she'd have it wrapped in a brown paper cover on our bookshelves after she'd smuggled it into the country, and made it very easy for the aunt children to know exactly where to go for their sexy reading.
Oh, wow. What a great mother. What did your mum do, Bettina?
Look, she had a sort of funny life. I mean, she was German originally and escaped from Nazi Germany, but standing up to the Nazis when she was still a schoolgirl. and they smuggled her out of the fishing village where she grew up to go to London as a au pair. And so she had a long, complicated story, and then they discovered she was actually very smart, and she ended up at the London School of Economics doing economics and so on. But she finally ended up as a social worker.
Oh, wow.
But married my father, who was an academic, and came to Australia. And he was one of the founding professors at the ANU, and they lived the rest of their lives there. And it meant that her social work qualifications were never recognised. So she was very much typical of women of that era who missed out because of lack of opportunities for women.
Yes.
No question.
But
But she spent her whole life, teaching migrants English and teaching the Australians German and looking after the community. And there's actually a street in Canberra named after both my parents.
Really?
My father for his work he was famous for his work in economics of Indonesia, but my mother was enormously involved in the community.
Wow.
Apart from looking after everyone's sex lives.
So it sounds like you definitely are a chip off two old blocks, really?
Very much so,
yes.
yeah.
Now back to the topic of our show today, where it is okay to not be okay, and looking a little more deeply into the issue around men's rights. Can we talk a little bit before we go to the first break about how misinformed we, the world, are about the subject, and get away from the political agenda and focus more on the real issues that affect people? And, things that first come to my mind are things like custody, suicide, legislative boundaries and things like that really affect how men are feeling.
Absolutely, and it's something I've been writing about for a long, long time. In fact, back in I think it was the 1980s, I was writing a little bit about family law, and I had a email from actually it was probably really a snail mail, a letter from a family court judge who was retiring, and he said, I was so right. I was pointing attention to the problems of fathers being denied contact with their children. And he said, we made a huge mistake in giving the custodial parent too much power, and there are many women abusing that power.
Yes.
And he gave me an amazing interview about all of that, talking about the fact that at that time, and women had absolute license as mums to move anywhere they liked, to just cut the men out of their lives if they wanted to not allow any contact between fathers and their children. And it was just a shocking state of affairs. And I got very involved in writing about that, ended up on various government committees trying to, funnily enough, representing men,
yes.
Because the women's groups were already extremely powerful and organised. They did a brilliant job lobbying for women, and yet there were very few people doing. There were starts of people working in various men's groups, but the problem with this whole area is well-educated, powerful men tend to use lawyers and fight individual battles rather than join organisations to fight for men's rights. And it was so true in family law. So the women's groups were just absolutely mowing down the feeble attempts of men to talk about what was happening to them. And somehow I found myself in there saying, well, hang on, what about the men here? What about the dads who are not seeing their kids?
And what sorts of feedback or resistance do you receive, Bettina, yourself, being a female, sort of being active in this space?
Oh, look, I've never been... it's been interesting because I used to, of course, be very popular with women's... And I worked for years and years and years supporting women's issues. And the Forum in its early days was very much promoting the rights of women as well as men, of course, and trying to get things to open up for men and women in terms of their sex lives and their personal lives. And I feel I've never moved from that position of wanting an equal playing ground. But I didn't think feminism was about grinding men into the dirt. And that's what's happened, that in actual fact, in innumerable areas when it comes to men's personal lives, women are walking all over men. Men are being denied basic rights when it comes to family law. The shocking area you mentioned is the issue of AVOs and domestic violence and so on, where that is being used right across Australia as a means of, as a sort of card to play in a divorce settlement, as an extremely effective card to deny men their, contact with children or get them out of the family home. Or there's new legislation being mooted now, which will give a further, in terms of division of property, it's going to give the victim of domestic violence more property if there's an AVO against the man. I mean,
but also, don't you think, Bettina, just makes everybody so much more vulnerable when these, constructs are all pulled apart and, everybody's left, fighting something that probably isn't even an issue to begin with, but how our legislation is being formed and I guess women, when they are in pain and when they're in that state of confusion that people are when relationships break down, aren't making logical decisions, but are being fed a whole range of options that possibly aren't the most useful options in terms of settling a family dispute.
No, everyone behaves bad. I mean, most of us unfortunately behave badly when we're angry and we're hurt and we're separating. Yes. And then you throw into the mix a lawyer who is deliberately provoking this sort of action. I mean, lawyers across Australia are advising women to take out AVOs and telling them you don't need any evidence of domestic violence. You can actually, allege that you were afraid of him, and that's enough. And it's just extraordinary.
Yes.
Magistrates and judges are being cowered into shutting up and not talking about what's happening. I've talked to many magistrates over the years who've said to me they're very concerned about what's happening. A couple have spoken out about it, but they know they'll just be torn apart if they speak publicly about it. We have very few leaders in the legal world who dare to talk about what a problem this has all become.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just in that field either. I remember when I was at the early stages of my advocacy and I went to speak to, I thought, using local government would be a great place to start, start with your community. And the response there immediately was absolutely not going to touch that issue at all, because that will just blow up and it'll be more trouble than it's worth. And I think, well, it is worth it because it's people that are being affected.
Oh, look, we have to start talking about it. And whenever I write about, for instance, domestic violence, I just get swamped with letters, not just from men, but from women. I mean, ordinary people listening to this know what is going on. There'll be men and women listening to this who had violent mothers, who are aware that domestic violence is a two-way street involving women as well as men. They know the propaganda that's being pushed out there saying it's all about violent men is wrong. Everywhere I go, I have people talking to me about this. You talk to, social workers, you talk to psychologists, you talk to doctors. They see male victims of violence. They see families where the real issue is the woman's violence. They see, families where there's two-way violence, and they see the real picture, which is this complex picture of violence within a family setting. Yes. And it's not just about males.
No.
Perpetrating, violence on women. And we know that. We know that Rosie Batty's husband had a mental health problem.
Yes.
So how come Rosie Batty no longer mentions mental health as a prime cause of domestic violence? And yet we have 1,700 peer-reviewed papers which talk about these complex causes of domestic violence, like mental health, like drug and alcohol abuse, which talk about the fact that it is actually much more common in certain socioeconomic groups. So if you compare Toorak to some lower socioeconomic part of Melbourne, it'll be 60 times more common, or in rural areas of Victoria, 60 times more common in some of our outback communities than it is in Toorak.
And wouldn't you say, Bettina, that
everywhere,
that could be largely due not because of the socio-economic, about the people, but more about the lack of resources, the lack of support, the lack of...
No, it's about, look, if we're talking about male attitudes to women, and that's, what you're hearing from our sort of propaganda units, the domestic violence industry, that promoting misinformation about this. They always say it's all about men's attitudes towards women,
Yes.
misogynist attitudes. And that applies in some communities much more than others. It applies much more in some of our ethnic communities, which have imported, unfortunately, very misogynist attitudes towards women into Australia. Yet we never talk about that because they're busily pretending it's across the board, it's in every suburb. And, of course, to some extent it is, but it's far more prevalent in certain communities than others. If we wanted to address violence, domestic violence, we'd be targeting the communities, we'd be targeting the groups which are most at risk.
Yes.
And we're not.
Yeah.
We're promoting this ridiculous idea that it's all about the way little boys are growing up. We're getting little boys to stand up in classes, in classrooms across Australia and, you know, denounce their own violence while the little girls watch in amazement.
Yes.
What on earth is going on here? Little girls know that in the playgrounds,
Yes.
yeah, they're in there with the archie-bargee and the bullying and all the stuff that goes on.
Yes, I have two sons and a daughter, and you know my sons are beautiful human beings who, you know, don't show any signs of disrespect to people in general. But Bettina, we're going to go to a break now. But when we come back, let's talk a bit more about the disparity and how do we move away from the men versus women argument, rather looking towards the basic human right of safety, security, dignity and freedom. And I'm Rae Bonney, joined in the studio, not live, but on the line today by Bettina Arndt. She's a respected social commentator and has worked with government advisory committees covering issues from childcare and ageing to family law and child support, often to advocate for men. She believes there are many aspects of men's personal lives where they really don't get a fair deal, and that's what we're talking about today. Welcome back to the show, Bettina.
Thank you, Ray.
No alarms went off in the break?
No, all peaceful.
But no, thank you again for coming on the show today. It's an absolute privilege and pleasure to have you. And in the break, we were talking about disparity and how do we move away from the men versus women argument, rather looking towards the basic human right of safety, security, dignity and freedom.
Yeah, I wish. No, I mean, it does drive me crazy that we're so willing to talk about women's rights, women's needs, women's wants.
Yes. And
when it comes to what men want, it just never makes it onto the agenda. I mean, one of the classic areas is sex. And a few years ago I wrote this book about sexual desire. If you walk down the streets of Australia and asked, what do men want? What are men not getting in their relationships? There's one outstanding issue that would emerge, and that's the answer would be more sex. The fact is that we have a lot of marriages and long-term relationships where there's very little sex happening, where women who aren't interested in sex, unfortunately, a lot of women go off sex as they get into their relationships after a while, and they feel totally entitled to shut up shop if they're not interested. And boy, is that a shift. If you think back to the 1950s and 60s when sex was still a part of the wifely duty and women just saw it as one of the areas of marriage where they would be, they were expected to negotiate and take care of their partners just as in other areas. He will do things for you that you don't necessarily feel like when you start off. Sex is an area which used to be part of the give and take of marriage, and it's just not anymore. And it's one of the absolute tragedies of our time, what's happened to sex in marriage for men.
So if we go back to the start of that, Bettina, your area of expertise, dating, so, it all starts off great, doesn't it? Because, we're all trying to impress each other and it's all exciting and, sex is usually high on the agenda at the beginning of a relationship. So where do you think things sort of get a bit off the rails there?
Well, in terms of women's sexual desire, there's really interesting research suggesting that women women have obviously strong libidos in certain situations. I make a distinction between dating in captivity and dating in the wild, or mating in the wild. It's all, if you look at mating in captivity, that's sort of domesticated sex, and that's where women tend to lose interest. Not all women. I have women who I call my juicy tomatoes, who maintain a thriving interest in sex throughout their relationships, but the majority of women are less interested. There's so many jokes about the fact that women tend to lose interest as time goes on.
Yes.
And it's interesting that early stage of relationship, they've found there's actually a different stage of different brain chemistry associated with being in love. That's what the psychologists call it limerence, that period where you're sort of weak at the knees about each other. And you do have a different mix of hormones going on at that stage associated with that in-love feeling, which I think artificially stimulates women's libido. But after a while, you get back to normal. Unfortunately, normal for women is a distracted libido where everything could get in the way of sex. Sex gets wrapped up in all the garbage of the day. And if you're, stressed out or tired or cross about the fact you didn't take the garbage out, or worried about something your mother-in-law said, or thinking about whether they've got cornflakes for breakfast tomorrow, all of that goes to bed with you and gets in the way of women feeling like having sex. That's a major issue.
Well, if we're getting back on track to, a major topic today, that really, really does affect a relationship, and, that's when we start seeing outcomes, I guess, that aren't what we expected at those early stages of dating when everything is rosy.
Yes, I'm doing, of course, a lot of work on dating. That's my day job now, which is online dating coaching, helping men and women start new relationships through online, websites. And I particularly work with older people, men and women over 50.
Yes.
And, it's interesting there because, of course, sex is one of the things that tends to get on the agenda fairly quickly for a lot of people.
Right. But isn't it the difference between friendship and, and an intimate relationship, the sex bit?
Yeah, but, it is interesting how it sort of escalates now, when if you meet someone and you go out with them, 3 or 4 times. There's a classic joke about, on the 3rd date or 4th date, expected to come across. And I do a lot of, I'm a sort of like a personal trainer when it comes to online dating, not only helping people with their profiles and so on, but talking through these sort of issues. No, you don't need to go to bed with someone. Just because there's an expectation you'll have sex on the 3rd date, you can actually have a conversation about that and say, I only go to bed with people I really know well, and I don't feel I know you well, and with my older women, I tend to put in a little saucy touch in their profiles because nothing works better to attract men than to give the indication that here is a woman who's still interested. But it means they have to be able to have that conversation and say, I don't leap into bed with people I don't know, and so I'm always encouraging people. How do they negotiate that sort of stuff? Well, how do they have that conversation? What should they say?
Yeah, not to mention the safety aspect as well.
Yeah, but to me, the safety aspect is all overblown. This whole notion that online dating is such a scary, frightening business, and there are all those sharks out there aiming to rip you off. It's crazy.
And it's like anything, Bettina. I'm an online dater, and I'm also a solo traveller as well, and I travelled most recently to Morocco. So online dating, oh my God, Rae, you're going to get killed, and travel to Morocco on your own, you're also going to get killed. But do you know what, Bettina? Common sense. It ain't that common, but how we keep ourselves safe, it's not that hard. And I see people that are also online dating that take enormous risks with their safety. Whereas, do your due diligence, people.
I know, most people. Look, most people are sensible. The same people who, get ripped off by a Nigerian con man are the people who would have handed over all their money once to an encyclopedia salesman at the front door.
Exactly.
They're always, it obviously is an area where people are in there. There are con men, there are people who are trying to rip people off.
Yes.
But the vast majority of people online are ordinary men and women wanting to meet each other.
Yes.
And that's how most single people are meeting, and it's just a miracle.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Area.
I've heard some amazing stories about people, joining up online, and it's, some very, very lovely outcomes. But Bettina, going back to disparity around even literature that's out in our environments, it doesn't matter like we were saying before, if a girl hits a boy, it's kind of okay, but it's so entrenched in our boys and social constructs that a boy can't even hit back to defend himself. And, you know, you and I were talking about the kind of...
Look, can I just say, Ray, I mean, neither should he. No, men and women shouldn't hit each other.
People shouldn't hit each other. But when we were talking about the literature that's out there, even through music, and you brought up a song, the Pink song, Please Don't Leave Me, where it's okay for Pink to sing about things, you know, I'm capable of really anything, I can cut you into pieces, how many times have I kicked you out of here? And she's portrayed in that video also of, you know, giving this guy a bit of a going over. So how is that acceptable?
I really wonder. And I mean, there are a lot of videos like that where women are allowed to be seen as aggressive. I mean, how often do you see in a movie, a so-called funny movie, a woman slapping a man and the whole audience roars with laughter?
Yep.
I mean, I always sit there infuriated.
Yes.
And particularly by the audience's reaction. And we have to start thinking about this.
Yes.
I mean, men are so vulnerable in that situation.
Yes.
If a woman is hitting a man, he can't even restrain her without being at risk of, you know, her calling the police and claiming that he was the one who was aggressive. And men hardly ever get hurt in that situation. If the police turn up at the door, she's claiming that he hit her or he was aggressive to her, and the man says, I was just trying to stop her hitting me. He might well end up in jail. He'll have an AVO served on him.
Yes.
I've talked to police all over the country who've said to me they know that in these circumstances often the story is not what they're hearing from the woman, but they're really being lent on very hard in our police departments to take action against the man.
Yes.
That's the prescribed policy.
Yes.
And some of them will listen to the men, but it's pretty rare.
Yes. And look, Bettina, we could be on air for the next 10 days talking about all of the issues associated with this particular topic. But last week you illuminated to me a movie that was produced last year by a feminist filmmaker, Cassie J, and it's called The Red Pill. And I did watch it a couple of times actually over the weekend, and I think it's such a great example of raising awareness around this issue, and in such a palatable way that's not, you know, it's certainly about men's rights, but not in a way that you'd expect. So do you want to talk a little bit about the movie?
Yeah, I mean, what's fascinating about this is here we have a young, well-known feminist filmmaker.
Yes.
And she originally went out to do something on the so-called rape culture on campuses, which is a lot of hogwash. But she thought she'd look at that. And she started talking to some of the men's groups around that issue. And she listened to what they were telling her and ended up doing her whole movie on men's issues of various sorts.
Yes.
And her funding was, you know, just disappeared. She was told it was a career-ending move to look at what's happening to men. They had to do crowdfunding to even get the movie made. And she's made a really interesting movie, very much her own story, about growing up as a feminist, believing in women's rights, and then just being appalled to discover there are so many really important issues about what's happening to boys and men that just don't get a look in. And she films the only violent, you know, when this movie was released, all the extreme feminist groups went out to try to shut it down and to say that it's, you know, promoting misogyny and violence towards women. Well, the only violence in the movie are the feminist demonstrators screeching at men's rights, you know, people talking about men's issues on campuses, for instance.
Yes.
And the feminist demonstrators setting off alarms, doing everything they can not allow people to be heard talking about these issues.
Well, that's right.
And here's Cassie is gobsmacked by what's happening, and she ends up saying she can't call herself a feminist anymore. And you can understand why the feminists don't like this and are trying to stop this happening. But the most extraordinary aspect of all of this is when this movie was released around the world last October, Australia became the only country in the world where viewings of this movie were closed down. Yes. The movie was banned. The Palace Cinemas in Melbourne had a screening, the first screening for Australia planned last October, and they pulled the plug when a group of women signed a petition saying it was misogynist and violent.
Yes.
And none of these people had seen the movie.
No.
Colours hadn't seen the movie. The demonstrators hadn't seen the movie, and yet we were told we can't see it because this group was objecting.
Yes, and the assumption of what it's about also, I think, leads me to think this is what the general consensus is around the world, is that the assumption that materials like this are all misogynist.
Yeah, and that there are no genuine issues to
yes.
be concerned about men, and that men still have all the power. And I really think people need to see this movie. It actually represents a huge hunk of my life, this movie. Issues I've been writing about for decades.
Yes.
And I think she does a terrific job.
I think so too, all contained into one red pill, in fact.
Yeah, one red pill. And it is just outrageous that in Australia, this little tiny minority group was able to influence not just that cinema. They made death threats against other cinema owners in Australia who were thinking of showing the movie. They tried to close down the businesses of people who had cinemas who were planning to show the red pill by flooding their websites with negative reviews and so on. I mean, it was a perfect example of the destructive nature of these social media campaigns, ill-informed social media campaigns that have an influence far beyond the numbers signing up to them.
Oh, absolutely. It's just, it's really hard for my brain to make sense of the disparity, and also it's just downright conflicting, with the actual issue.
And the fact that we let them get away with it. I mean, that's what makes me hopping mad. And ever since this happened late last year and I wrote about it, and I had so many people say they wanted to be able to judge for themselves, to see this movie and see what they thought. And they were outraged that people would stop them allowing that access.
Yes.
Anyway, I've been working on it ever since, and we've now got this fantastic system. There's an organisation called FanForce, which allows people anywhere in Australia who want to see this movie to host a screening of the movie in their local area through FanForce. And it's all just beginning to happen. Rae, you're very kindly getting involved in trying to get the first screening through FanForce up in Melbourne, which I'm delighted about. But we're going to do it all over Australia. And it's about not letting those wicked witches win. I mean, how dare those women think that they have the right to decide what we can see?
That's right. Freedom of viewing, freedom of speech. It's what we're all about here in Australia. But look, anyone else that wants to see it now, you can watch it through Vimeo, which is one of the online places you can go.
But I think a lot of people would rather see it in a movie theatre. We're going to be organising some, sometimes a bit of Q&A discussion afterwards.
Oh, definitely.
And we really want to get people out seeing the movie in movie theatres.
Yes.
Because that is how we make a point that we have a right to see what we want to see. And I think that is a really important message. Far too often, when it comes to issues concerning men and men's rights, we all just shut up and cop it. And I think it's very important we go out there and be seen attending, screenings of this movie to make a point.
Yes, and also just learning, educating ourselves around what is real. And again, I don't feel that this is a propaganda movie one bit. I think it's a great education into a lot of things we're missing out on. And also this year, Bettina, you're a keynote speaker at the 3rd International Conference on Men's Issues at the Gold Coast, June 9th to 11th. And I'm also attending, which I'm pretty excited about as well. So what will you be speaking about?
Oh, I'm going to be doing a sort of keynote about, I suppose, the sort of things we've been talking about today, how I got involved in writing about men, the issues that I've grappled with over the years. I mean, a whole range that we haven't talked about.
Yes.
Male suicide and why it is that men are committing suicide at such a higher rate than women. Boys' education. Years ago, there was all this kerfuffle where parents across Australia started to notice that their boys were doing really badly. There was a parliamentary commission held, a Senate inquiry. They set up all these new programs to try to address the problem of boys not engaging in education. And it's all just fallen in a heap, of course. because that all happened under John Howard. People forget what a leader John Howard was when it came to men's issues. I mean, he was the only Prime Minister we've ever had, and I think maybe we'll ever have, who spoke up for men, who talked about the fact that children have a right to a father in their lives. Who, started to question some of the new orthodoxy in these sort of areas. And he was an extraordinary man, and didn't get enough credit for that. I mean, the big changes in family law where finally it was recognised that, there was a right, children had a right to contact with both parents after marital separation. And that's been wound back too, but, he actually, that meant a big shift in how we approach parenting after divorce. Whole range of issues he really pushed along, and ever since then it's just been 5 steps backwards, and I'm just tearing my hair out.
I'm sure we could bring him out of retirement, couldn't we?
Yeah,
Bettina?
Be good. But it's interesting, some of the crossbenchers, David Lionhelm in Sydney, for instance, he's been grilling, in Senate estimates, grilling some of the bureaucrats about the misinformation around domestic violence, about the fact that they're lying about the statistics. He's put a whole lot of questions on notice about why they are deliberately playing up male aggression and downplay women's role in family violence. So there are some people out there, Pauline Hanson, who of course everyone chooses to sneer at and hate, but at least she's listening to what's happening in the family courts and the ABOs and so on.
That's right. She's just not an armchair commentator like many.
Yeah. So there's stuff, but the major parties are just abysmal. Malcolm Turnbull has been. I used to hand out how to vote things for Malcolm Turnbull for years and years and years, and then on domestic violence, he's been so appalling that I absolutely refuse to have anything to do with him anymore.
Yeah, well, that's a stand in itself. But you know what, Bettina, we're going to go to a break before we come back, can you believe, for our final segment, which is going to be a little bit more about you, but just on a different topic. But it just bloody astounds me. Like, I'm a mother of boys, and there are plenty of mothers of boys, sisters, aunts, who have beautiful relationships with men. How do we get to this point where men are so disregarded and invalidated? It just don't get it. You still there, Bettina?
Yeah,
did I just floor you with that?
Oh, sorry, I was just I thought you were leading into our break. So
I am going into the break. But
sorry.
But I was speaking to my little one Rory yesterday. Rory regularly appears on my show. He's only 8 years old, but he speaks regularly on some of these topics because he listens to everything I say. He's got opinions as well, but he said he chose a song that he thought might go very well for this particular break, and he said it's called Hooked on a Feeling. I am joined on the line, amongst many, many other things, social commentator on men's rights issues, Bettina Arndt. But this has gone way too fast, Bettina, hasn't it?
It has. I've enjoyed talking to you, Rae.
Now, let's get a little bit more upfront and personal with you. You told me your own story of love over the weekend.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, which was luckily a success story when it
so
comes
far.
to online dating. Which, I was online for many years, for 7 years. And when I first heard about online dating, I immediately decided that was for me, because I just was very conscious of the fact that it's really difficult as a single person to meet other eligible people.
Yes.
And I always found the process of going out as a single person, hoping you'll bump into someone at a party or a pub or whatever. I mean, I just think that's really humiliating to go out searching when you don't, you start chatting to someone at a party and his wife pops up next to him. And I mean, you can't say, "Are you single?" Can you? As the first question in a conversation.
Can't you?
No, well, I just think, I hated all of that stuff. Yes. And here you have online, this enormous pool of people most of whom are legitimate people looking for partners. They're all single, and it's just fantastic. So the minute I heard about it, I decided to get involved when I was on my own, and did lots of dating. Probably met hundreds of men, and a number of serious relationships with people along the way. And then, a funny story, about 3 years ago, There's been this guy I'd looked at a few times, but he had the world's worst photo. I thought he looked just dreadful, and I had no intention of contacting him. And then he happened to hear me on the radio talking about writing how do you do a good profile, and the fact that you can't just claim to have a good sense of humour, you have to write something funny. And so he went out and wrote his profile, and he did a pretty good job. It was quite amusing. And one day I just happened to glance at it, and I thought, oh, well, he may look pretty ghastly, but he's pretty funny. Yeah. And so I sent him a kiss, and I sent him, a contact message saying I wanted to talk to him. And he responded, and we then, I believe in not having endless coffee dates, so I think it's much more fun to actually do something on that first date. Go, and in this case, we were going for a walk in the park with my dog. Yes. And he says he never forgets me bounding down the hill with a big grin on my face. And the first thing I said to him was, "Oh my God, you're so much better looking than I thought you were going to be." And that's how it all began. So you are.
Which is always the way. And I love his profile that he wrote about himself. Can I read it out?
Yeah, well, you read it.
About me. Discovering the inner nerd / woman / child / caveman. Incredibly smart, articulate, sensitive, artistic, good looking, tall, fit, healthy, successful. Really, I've got it all. Also, I forgot humble as well. I love good food, wine, arty foreign movies, even smaltzy chick flicks. Travel to interesting and exotic locations, fluffy cute animals, and long romantic walks on the beach in the bush. Who doesn't? I'm into mountain climbing, skydiving, deep sea diving, base jumping, running marathons, bungee jumping, Ironman events, and also extreme hopscotch. I love that. Above all, I take myself very seriously, as this search for true love is no joke. Okay, maybe I've been exaggerating just a little, and really, I'm no good at the hopscotch. Actually, I really prefer to have a gentle stretch, doing some yoga, followed by a quiet lie down. We're all the product of the experiences we have had in the past, but that just leads us to the present moment and the future, which is both unknown and unknowable. Meeting a person for the first time is a glimpse into the possible future of new experiences. Maybe these will be just a repeat of the past, or perhaps something entirely new. Above all, I try to be open to new possibilities, but also like to go deeper in understanding what really surrounds me. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication.
There you are.
And I thought,
what a nice man.
What a great man, and he's a lucky man, and you're a lucky woman. But in wrapping the show, because Ian is actually a bass player as well, is that correct?
Yeah, he's an architect, but he's luckily he has a day job, which most musicians need. Yeah. But he's also a double bass player, and I knew nothing about music until before we got together. And boy, is there something sexy about a big man wrapped around that enormous instrument.
Well, you're a sex writer, aren't you?
I am.
No, but I thought you sent me through the photos of him, and I thought the dreadful one that you sent through didn't look too bad.
Oh, well.
But the one when he's holding his saxophone, is
it's a bass.
Is it a bass? Oh, sorry, yeah. Bass. I'm not very good with instruments, but the first thing I noticed about him was his hands. He's got
I know.
Very nice hands.
I remember sitting at that, when we finally did have our cup of coffee, and sitting across from him and looking at those hands. Yes. And I had lovely thoughts, so there you are.
But I think it's a great note, pardon the pun there as well, to take the show out on, Bettina. It's, as I said before, thank you so much for speaking so openly about your insights and experiences in this really, really important topic. You know, this is not mucking around. Of the 8 suicides that we know of every day in Australia, 6 are men, and the amount of times every week that I stand in front of crowds of people and state that fact, it's a fact, it's not just a statistic, the jaws drop the ground saying, I had no idea. Well, bloody do something about it. You know, it's a really good place to start some of the stuff that we've talked about today.
And go to the red pill. And
Yes.
It's a very good place to start, to send a strong message that we care about men's issues.
Because men do matter as well.
They do.
They do.
I like men. I've always liked men.
I do too.
I'm a mother of 2 sons as well as a daughter. I've had a wonderful father in my life. And there must be a lot of other women listening to this who have lovely, loving men in their lives. And we need to stand up for them.
Absolutely.